Hello everyone, welcome back to Scylla's Podcats, or welcome to Scylla's Podcats, and welcome to another video where I tell you something about queer books that I like in specific genres, so you have some sort of starting point if you have never read queer fiction before, and or just merely want to expand your knowledge, because, you know, whatever you want, we support it. So today I wanted to talk about sci-fi. Quick disclaimer, I have not read as much sci-fi as I have read, for example, fantasy, and so there is a very high chance that there are some fantastic, in this case specifically queer queer sci-fi books that I am missing out on. So if you have any recommendations, please feel free to pop them down below. And also, keep in mind I am probably not going to mention every single queer sci-fi book that I have ever read as well, simply because if I did that, this video would still be an astoundingly long time. Simply because if I pick up sci-fi, there is a high chance I am picking up a queer sci-fi, because I like that. Another disclaimer, sci-fi is a very large genre. There's a lot of subcategories there, there's a lot of different ideas there that, you know, get reproduced and represented in very different ways. So just because you find yourself liking sci-fi does not necessarily mean you're going to like every single book on this list. Alright? Fantastic. So, let's go. Today, because I don't have as neat of a, you know, separation as I had with short fiction, I thought I was just going to try and separate the books I want to talk about into two categories. Category number one is going to be standalones. These are going to be all of the sci-fi books I've read that either don't have a planned sequel, because, you know, maybe there will be a sequel, maybe there won't be, but the end was satisfying enough to go, you know, this is fine. Let's just stay here, I suppose. Or the books that have very, very clearly not planned a sequel and will not have a sequel, ever. So I want to talk about these first, and the second category are going to be books where the sequel is either very clearly planned, even with some sort of publication date in mind, or where sequels actually already exist and the entire thing is a series. So let's dive right in to the standalones. First and foremost, I want to mention a few that I don't have with me physically, just so I don't forget that they exist, because I will. But first and foremost, let's talk about one that I've actually only finished this month, because it was the book for Steph's book club, which I will be leaving a link down below as well. Also, I will be leaving a link for Steph, because you should check her out because she's amazing, especially considering that she reads a lot more sci-fi than I do. But the book I'm talking about is Bluebird by Ciel Pierrot. This is a standalone, I think the way it was described to me was Gunslinger Lesbians in Space, which I thought sounded fantastic, and honest to God, having read it, it was such a good time. If you're looking for fast-paced action, if you're looking for really nice character work, even within a, let's just say, firmly established framework that's not necessarily trying to hide what it is. So if you go into Bluebird expecting to be wowed by every single plot twist, you might not want to pick this one up, because I personally found it fairly predictable, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's just a thing, in my opinion, so keep that in mind if you go into it. But basically, in Bluebird, the space is split into 3 factions, and our main character is running away from one of those factions. I have forgotten the names of almost everything because my memory card is even smaller than the one on my camera, but basically one of the factions is more or less concerning itself with, like, death. One is technology, and the other one is plants, life. So you have 3 very typical aspects that a lot of fantasy or sci-fi books will present to you in some form, like deities, factions, technological advancements, whatever have you. And our main character is running away from these because her faction made her do things that she despised and that she, honest to God, never wants to talk about again, and also never wants to experience again, so she's dedicated her life to being a rebel to essentially all 3 factions, and she's only trying to save her own people, who are being brutalized by these regimes, primarily her own faction, unfortunately. There's a lot of shenanigans, the dialogues are fantastic, the banter is very witty and snappy, and I just had a thoroughly good time with it, honestly. So if you're looking for something like that, I highly recommend you check out Bluebird. Now, another standalone, which is maybe not exactly in the same vein, but as a almost comfort read felt similar to me, is Light from Uncommon Stars by Raika Aoki. This is a book primarily, if not almost entirely, set on Earth, so, you know, we don't have any fancy spaceware, but the thing that made this book so special to me is because it has a lot of stories combined into one. Light from Uncommon Stars combines the story of a young trans violinist trying to make it in the world and trying to find her place and her people and with whom she belongs. It combines that with someone who has made a pact with the devil and who has to give the devil souls, aka great violinists, every 7 years, I believe, something along those lines. We don't, of course that works very well together, but we also have an alien who manages a donut shop. No, I'm not kidding. I personally really enjoyed Light from Uncommon Stars. It is very wild, it's very wacky, there's a lot of elements that are combined within it, but, and I'm going to phrase this as gently as I can, if you are a fan of fanfiction, if you like those tropes where you combine coffee shop AUs with, so alternative universes, with the canon that is a lot more action-paced, for example, if you like that in any capacity, you want to check out Light from Uncommon Stars. Trust me when I say this. Fair warning, the character is trans and does deal with a lot of transphobia directed at her, partly from her family, partly from strangers, and partly from herself. She's very self-conscious about her voice and her body and everything with it, but the book itself ultimately is honestly just about self-love and not necessarily just that, but also just finding the people you belong to that will take you in whichever way you are. So it's wonderful in that regard. But if these themes are triggering to you, just be prepared when you go into this book. And last but certainly not least, we have another graphic novel, and the reason I did not include this in the short fiction part is because this graphic novel is very long. I do believe it's over 500 pages. So I thought, yes, of course, graphic novels read very fast, but maybe let's not include that in a short fiction queer recommendations video. And the one I'm talking about is On a Sunbeam by Tillie Walden. I unfortunately don't have a copy yet. I really want to have one though, because this graphic novel is incredibly beautiful. I really love Tillie Walden's drawing style, and On a Sunbeam has these beautiful panels that are very much monochrome in colors, but that still manage to express so much when it comes to outer space, when it comes to different planets, when it comes to the people and the emotions that they are currently experiencing. I don't remember too much about the plot because it's been a while since I've read it, but I really wanted to give it a shout out because it is absolutely beautiful, and I highly recommend you check it out. Even if you can get it from the library, as I did, do yourself the favor and check it out, just because it is so beautiful. And I love it so much. Alright, that out of the way, let's get into the standalones I actually physically own. So first of all, and this is unfortunately not going to be for my English audience because there is not an English translation, and I don't know if there ever will be an English translation, because let's just say German books don't always get translated, and leave it at that. But I have recently read a very fun space adventure, and it is Ace in Space by Christian and Judith Vogt. There is technically a second book. It is a tiny little novella called Ace in Space Trident. This is why I still included it in standalones. So Ace in Space, for those of you who are interested and can read the German language, Ace in Space is about these rogues. Like, they're a bit like motorbike gangs, I would say, and they, you know, they live in outer space and they do their things that are not necessarily very lawful, but they're just, you know, far enough away from being outright criminal actions that they don't get prosecuted for it more often than not. And our main character, Danai, who is a pilot fleeing from the Hadronic incorporations, so, you know, just away from all of that, gets to take part in the Daredevils, which is a gang led by her mother. However, we don't just stay with the gang, because of course we don't, because a planet is currently being attacked, you know, partially by Hadronics Incorporated, because they have a very large, very specific mineral that is important, among other things, for space travel, and Danae finds herself trying to both be part of the Daredevils, but also trying to help this planet, this colony that is under attack. The action scenes in this one were fantastic. There's a lot of, like, space races because of the biker gangs, but there's also a lot of, like, legitimate fight scenes, partially around the colony, and I personally really enjoyed how all of this was incorporated into the book. Ace in Space Trident is set after this one, so if you pick this one up and you want to read Ace in Space Trident, read it after, because you're going to get spoilers, among other things, of who survives at the end of this book, because, you know, some people die, as you do in armed conflicts. It's a really fun, tiny story, mostly about Danae and her two lovers. Little spoiler alert, but, you know, this is partially why it is so queer. For anyone who can speak German, I do highly recommend this. It was a lot of fun to read. So, there you have it. Moving away from books that only a very small percentage of my audience can actually read and understand, let's talk about some English standalones. I think I'm going to start with, you know what, let's just start with my favorite one of them. So this, I debated putting this into short fiction, but then I realized, you know, it is 200 pages, and I just thought, you know what, why not put it here, because it's not really a novella, is it? And I am, of course, talking about This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Motor and Mags Gladstone. This is my favorite book of all times. There is no book out there that can fully top what this book has made me feel. So what This Is How You Lose the Time War is about is, it's about these two time agents, both employed by different agencies who want to win the time war, as the title suggests. One of them is just called Red, and the other one is just called Blue. Blue is part of the Garden, and Red's, you know, belonging is just called the Agency, and both are supposed to subtly or not so subtly influence the worlds around them and the different time strands around them in order to let their agency win the war. However, they start meeting, and by meeting I mean they are part of the same conflicts on different sides, and they notice each other's, you know, tries to let their agency, their respective agency, win, and they start exchanging letters. This entire book is basically just, every single chapter is from, for example, Red's, if the chapter is from Red's point of view, you will get Blue's letter. If the chapter is from Blue's point of view, you will get Red's letter at the end of it. A book like that is usually also called an epistolary, because it is primarily about the two exchanging letters. They don't meet in person for a very, very long time, and even when they meet, it's a bit more complicated. I don't want to spoil it, so I'm not going to say it. The thing that makes this book so incredibly unique to me is just how emotive the prose is. It's very, it goes into the direction of purple prose, and I need to say this right now, purple prose for me is a compliment. I know it's not for other people, but it's a very complex and rich prose with a lot of puns in them that you will only be able to recognize if you know a bit more about language, for example. But overall, if you like epistolaries, if you like queer yearning across time and space, if you like enemies to lovers, if you like time shenanigans, you need to read This Is How You Lose the Time War. It also comes with highest recommendations from just about all of my friends. Remember the book club I talked about? This was the book club read for May, if I remember correctly, and every single host gave it 5 stars. I'm just saying. There you have it. They read a lot more sci-fi than I do, and they gave this 5 stars. So, if you need more, you know, glowing reviews of this, there you have it. It is fantastic, and I need to put it down now, because otherwise I'm not going to talk about the other books I have. Alright, Going to another one that is fairly short with just about-ish 300 pages, we have Unwieldy Creatures by Adi Tsai. This is set on our planet, and it is set in a vague future that is never fully defined, like we don't have a special year, for example. And this book in particular first of all, very important, this is a Frankenstein retelling, and it is a very, I would say, a Frankenstein retelling that keeps very close to the original, and also very specifically calls out to certain parts in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. When I say this, I mean there's actual legitimate quotations in this book pertaining to Frankenstein. So if that is not necessarily your thing, I do recommend you skip this one. However, if you are now interested, or specifically interested because you're a Frankenstein fan like me, just putting that out there, let me tell you a little bit about Unwieldy Creatures. So, unlike in Frankenstein, where Frankenstein, you know, sews his monster back together from different body parts, Unwieldy Creatures talks a lot about in vitro fertilization, and more specifically, in vitro gametogenesis, which essentially mean transfer stem cells into gametes, which are the ones that carry information to unborn children, for example. So like sperm would inhabit gametes, but stem cells remain in your own body. This is what every single cell in our body is made from, because they transform on the way. And the reason this is so special in Unwieldy Creatures is because in vitro gametogenesis has not necessarily been, you know, that big on the market yet, at all, in fact. However, it feels very likely, which is something that happens a lot throughout the book. A lot of the specifically scientific endeavors that our main character Z, the Frankenstein stand-in essentially, partakes in sound very plausible from a slightly futuristic point of view. And what Dr. Frank, or Z as she's usually called, tries to do is she tries to create a child without the addition of sperm, so cis male gametes. And of course, just like in Frankenstein, things go wrong. This book talks a lot about science gone wrong. It talks about the ethical problem that underlies a lot of the creation process that humans try to intervene with in whichever way possible. It talks about the intersection of queer identities, of queer relationships. It is, in my opinion, a fantastic book. The reason I put it into sci-fi is because it relies so fundamentally on the science that it talks about. So it doesn't have your typical sci-fi setting in space or whatever, and it doesn't necessarily have a incredibly futuristic approach, because as I said, a lot of the science sounds very plausible even from today's standards, but it is so enmeshed in the science that partakes in this book that this is very important. A very important addition to the sci-fi genre, in my humble opinion. Also, this cover is fantastic. Also, I am totally not biased because I didn't write my BA thesis about this whatsoever. And I do believe I also made a review a while back, so I'm just going to be linking that down below as well. Alright, I think I should try and pick up the pace a little bit. Let's talk about 3 more standalones, and then let's get to some of the series that I have amassed. So, one that is actually very new, I do believe it came out this year, is Welcome to Forever by Nathan Tavares. Now, this book very specifically has a lot to do with a trauma, and a lot to do with memory loss, memory recovery, and memory corruption, which I personally found very interesting. Basically, in this world, you can upload your memories into a cloud storage, and you can also alter those memories. And our main character, Fox, is a memory editor. He is responsible for example, if someone is like, well, I want to experience the, like, emotions of having been at a beach without ever having been at a beach, Fox is your man. He will edit your memory and he will give you that beach memory that you've been wanting. However, Fox, at the beginning of the book, wakes up with almost no recollections of his previous life, and most specifically, no recollections of his husband. Because his husband and the memory of his husband, as well as the memory his husband inhabited, have been blown up by a terror attack on the so-called Khadija Banks, which is where all of those memory storage files are located. And Fox is now trying to recover his memories through a let's call it, futuristically very weird cult-like approach to therapy. There we go. What I liked so much about this book is how incredibly unreliable the narration is. This is first-person narration, mind you, so if that's not your thing, there you have it. But because Fox doesn't know anything as well, we as the reader, even when we try to believe Fox, we have to understand he doesn't know the truth, because his memories are quite literally missing. And I liked that about the book so much, because the book very much led you onto a lot of false paths, simply because Fox himself was utterly convinced of something, and then had to realize, no, I remembered that completely wrong. I found that very fascinating, which is why I don't even want to tell you anything else about this book, because I am going to be giving everything away, because I don't remember when anything happened. It's 400 pages. I don't remember what got revealed, so let's just leave it at that and say that I really, really loved it. This one is a bit more noir, mystery, sci-fi-esque fiction, and I am of course talking about The Sleepless by Victor Manibo. This is also fairly new. I think it came out in 22 or 23, something along those lines. Let's see... Yes, in 22. Now, one thing I do want to tell you about The Sleepless before I talk about anything else is this book is heavily pandemic related. The pandemic happening in The Sleepless is not COVID. It is a pandemic where people just stop being able to sleep, essentially, which is why they're called The Sleepless. But this idea of a pandemic is very much, you know, happening throughout the book, so if this is something that is triggering to you or that you don't want to read because of everything that's been happening, I fully understand, and this is your chance to back out now. But in, you know, essence, The Sleepless deals with our protagonist, Jamie Vegas, who is a journalist and who discovers his boss dead at his desk. And he doesn't know what happened. And throughout the entire book, Jamie is trying to figure out what exactly has been going on. Why is his boss dead? Who killed him? Was it suicide, like all of the police officers, you know, suggest, or was someone else there? And why is Jamie the last one who has seen his boss, but does not remember what they talked about? I really enjoyed this book. I enjoyed the mystery aspect of it, and I also really enjoyed the way that Victor Manibo engaged with the whole sleepless concept, because essentially what happened is because people became sleepless, capitalism just fully took a stab at that and was like, well, if you're sleepless, that means, well, if you don't have to sleep, you can just work, right? So you can just take like 15 different jobs and 3 different shifts on every day. You can just work. Hooray. It's very bleak in that regard, honestly, but it sounds very plausible from where we are right now with capitalism, so if you're not in for that capitalist hellhole plausibility, I would also recommend giving this book a pass. But if any of that sounded interesting to you, I highly recommend The Sleepless, because I personally found it fantastic and I really enjoyed the mystery aspect of it all, because like with Welcome to Forever, this book also leads you down a lot of different paths of like, well, maybe this person did it, or maybe that person did it. Who knows? Not me, not you. Go find out yourself. So I really enjoyed it, and I hope that if you pick this up, you enjoy it too. And last but certainly not least, for the standalones, we have The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez. I loved this book. So what I've really enjoyed about The Vanished Birds is it has this very unique approach to time travel specifically, because it does talk a lot about the fact that, you know, since humanity has expanded into space, they needed a way to be able to, for example, travel between different planets without the person traveling aging like 30 years or something. And the beginning of the book, the very first part, is told not necessarily from the perspective of one of the main characters, but from the perspective of someone interacting with that main character. And that someone is a person from a planet that is, you know, being visited every now and then for their resources, and he keeps aging while she doesn't, because of course she doesn't. She is traveling between time in order to get back and to the planet that he lives on. But I found that part so impactful, because I don't think a lot of authors that very specifically talk about time travel or the, you know, aspects of traveling in space while not losing so much time from the perspective of an outsider looking at someone who is doing the whole traveling thing. And I found that so incredibly impactful that the book was already a favorite at that point, essentially. The book also is more or less split into two different perspectives and two different timelines. The first one is from a woman who is from Earth, who is essentially preparing the project of humanity launching into space, and the second one is after humanity has already successfully, you know, established themselves in space, a captain who finds a very odd boy who, for some reason, does not want to talk to anyone because he has been traumatized and she doesn't know what happened. It was fantastic. This was my first Simon Jimenez book, and it immediately made me go, alright, I'm going to just read everything this author puts out because his writing style is fantastic and I love it so much. So if you are in for some lush, really beautiful prose, with a lot of sci-fi, with a lot of mystery, with some time travel shenanigans involved, and also, again, some looming corporation threat in the background, because it wouldn't be sci-fi if we didn't have that, I suppose. I highly recommend The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez. Alright, that was all the standalones. Now, let's talk about the series. So first of all, I'm going to be mentioning I think it's actually just one, if I'm seeing that correctly. I'm going to be mentioning the one that I don't have physically with me, because otherwise, as I have established, I will forget it exists. And the book I'm talking about is obviously The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. The second book came out this year, if I remember that correctly. I do not remember the title right now, but the first one, The Space Between Worlds, has already come out in 2021, and in my opinion, it is a fantastic book. What The Space Between Worlds is about is our protagonist, whose name I have unfortunately forgotten, but never we mind that, has the ability to travel to different alternate dimensions. However, she can only do that if her counterpart in that alternate dimension is already dead. And she's working for this corporation who are using her abilities to do that in order to, obviously, gain profit. And I personally really loved the idea of these alternate dimensions that are only open to travel if you cannot encounter your doppelganger, essentially, in those alternate universes. I really loved that. I personally found The Space Between Worlds to be fantastic, and I'm very excited to read the second book. Haven't gotten to it yet. Should probably reread the first one before I do that, because I don't remember a lot else about the book. So, that's a project for the future. Haha. Continuing on, let's talk very briefly about the two YA editions that I have to this list. So first and foremost, we have Iron Widow by Shiran J. Zhao. This is as the author themselves said, this is said during a scientific, like sci-fi imagining of China's only empress, Wu Zetian, as she is here. Wonderful. And the concept is basically kind of similar to an anime called Darling in the Franxx. Don't watch it. It's not worth it. But the concept is very interesting, which is that there is mechas that can be piloted if a boy and a girl work together. And in this case, specifically, as it is in Darling in the Franxx, to be quite honest, the women are getting exploited by their male counterparts. And so, the reason Wu Zetian in this book is, you know, doing what she's doing is because she's trying to avenge her sister, who has been exploited and subsequently killed by a pilot of one of those mechas. And she is trying to right this wrong. What I like so much about Iron Widow is, if you like female rage, you are probably going to like Iron Widow. Because if there's one thing that Wu Zetian is, it's angry. And I liked that so much about her, because she is not your, I would say, typical female protagonist. Not in the sense of she's not like other girls, but in the sense of that Shiran lets her do a lot of very horrific things. This is practically a villain story in the making. That's very important to understand here. Wuzitian is not a good person. She's also not necessarily a girl's girl. She wants to take the system down, whatever it takes, and whoever is in her way. She's very angry at just about anyone. She's angry at her family because they had her feet bound, which is a horrific practice. Don't Google that while you're eating. She's angry at her mother because her mother did not protect her. She's angry at the system. She's angry at male pilots. She is mad at just about everyone. And the thing that I liked about Iron Widow so much is because is that anger is always there. And no one is, well, yes, of course people are trying to forbid her from doing that, but no one is really stopping her in that. She just gets to be angry at everyone and everything that has wronged her, and I personally loved that. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, and you want a little bit of a fast-paced mecha action, YA first installment in a duology where the second book is technically supposed to be coming out, there have been a lot of issues, and you would like to support Sudan, I highly recommend you check out Iron Widow, because I had a blast with it. And the second one I'm talking about is one where the sequel is planned, but we don't have it yet, and that is The Darkness Outside Us by Elliot Schrafer. This is a sci-fi, I would say mystery, honestly, probably, and it's about Ambrose and Kodiak, two boys who have been assigned the honor of being on a spaceship together and basically finding new places to live outside in the universe. They are not the best of friends at the beginning. Their spaceship is very neatly split in the middle, and up until like a very important moment at the beginning, Ambrose has never seen Kodiak and does not even know who he is, how he is, what his deal is. And so I wouldn't call it enemies to lovers because I have a gripe with people calling everything enemies to lovers, but they certainly are strangers, and at least Kodiak intends to remain a stranger. However, this is very dangerous and also quite impossible on such a long journey as these two are undertaking. I personally really enjoyed this one, and there is a twist that I did not see coming, I won't lie. So if you're in for a little bit of a mystery, if you're in for space travel, two boys, all alone, just separated by one door that they could both open if they wanted to, I highly suggest you check out The Darkness Between Us, and I am very excited for the sequel. And now we have 3 remaining, and my battery is not doing too well, so let's see if I can finish this up quickly. Let's start with the one where the books themselves don't have the strongest connection to each other, which is very fortunate because it means you can basically start wherever you want to, and that is the Wayfarer series by Becky Chambers, starting with The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. I've talked about Becky Chambers in my video on short fiction before. I'm mentioning her here again because she is fantastic. Thank you very much. And the magical thing about the Wayfarer series, which encapsulates 4 books and 1 novella so far, the novella is called To Be Told If Fortunate, is that every single installment in the series has a different protagonist and a different setting, and so they are only connected through background characters. The only thing I'm going to tell people getting into this series is if you, start with The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, to read A Close and Common Orbit after that. Because A Close and Common Orbit is the only one that directly, starts after The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, and also includes characters that prominently feature in this one, so you are going to get spoiled for the end of The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet if you read A Close and Common Orbit first. With the other 2, however, it does not matter. Yes, there are some very tenuous connections, but those are so minuscule that it does not matter if you start with one of those 2 first, if you start with this one first, if you have 3 years in between reading them because you just didn't get to the next one. It doesn't matter. Trust me. The wonderful thing about Becky Chambers is that because of that, every single one of those 4 books has a very distinctly different focus. The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet is the one that is probably the most action-focused, because this is specifically about a young woman named Rosemary Harper who joins the team on the Wayfarers, who are responsible for punching wormholes through space in order to allow easy traffic access, and she, among other things, gets embroiled in an armed conflict on the so-called Small and Angry Planet. Because it's small and there's a lot of wars. I love I love it very much. There is a lot of shenanigans, there's a lot of getting to know the people on the ship, there's a lot of found family tropes in the series in general, but in this one specifically, and as I said, this one is the most action-focused. So if you find yourself enjoying that aspect about it, I do want to warn you very gently, the other three do not have that much action. Not in the way of armed conflicts, not in the way of exciting space races, none of that. Which, you know, might be unfortunate for some, might be the thing that they're looking for. What a lot of Becky Chambers' books deal with, specifically, is introspection of the characters. I wouldn't necessarily call her books incredibly slow, but I would call them slow in the sense of there is not that much happening outside of the characters more often than not. And a lot of the things that are happening outside of the characters directly, you know, translate to inner character development. This is something that Becky Chambers excels at, and so if that's what you're looking for in your sci-fi books, I can only sing her praises. There's nothing negative I could say about her works. Nothing. Her books are fantastic. So, if any of that sounded interesting to you, I highly recommend you check out the series. And if you want to start with The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, like I said, just read A Close and Common Orbit after it, and then you're good. Let's get into these are my favorites, and one of them is concerning. But these are also, the last two series are series that I think a lot of people have also heard about, and the first one is obviously the Locked Tomb series by Tamsin Muir. This is the first book called Gideon the Ninth, and I love this series. There's 4 books planned so far. We have 3 out. We have Gideon the Ninth, Hera the Ninth, and Nona the Ninth, and Electa the Ninth is planned, and we don't really know when it's going to be releasing. So if you're someone who likes finished series, maybe wait for a little bit longer, because we don't know when it's going to be finished. But this series deals with necromancers, but in space. The thing about the Locked Tomb series is that it can very easily be fit into either fantasy or sci-fi. So if you're a fan of those overlapping ideas behind everything, I do actually highly recommend this series to you. It's very dark, it's very bloody, and the thing that you have to know first and foremost is every single book has a different narrator, and every book has the narrator and focal character who does not know shit. It's very important. Gideon does not know shit about the situation that she stumbles into. Hera the Ninth, as you know, you might have guessed, is from Hera's perspective, who at the time also doesn't know what's going on. And Nona the Ninth is from Nona's perspective, who at the time, you guessed it, also doesn't know what's going on. The entire point of these books is to be confusing because the main characters are confused. If that is not your thing, I do not recommend you start with this series because it is going to remain the exact same, just with different characters and in different scenarios. And so a lot of the time questions are posed that the reader can only answer either by continuing on with the series, so a lot of the books have answers in that, you know, for questions that were asked in the book before them, or if the reader is able to pay attention to very minute details that the main characters do not pay attention to. I personally am a fan of that, and so this series did everything it had to do for me personally. And if you enjoy something like this, you are probably going to enjoy this series too. Trust me with that. Apart from that, let's just say Gideon, at the very least, is an incredibly funny book. So, if you want a funny character who wields a sword and is also a, you know, raging lesbian, I would check out Gideon, at the very least. But yes, be careful with characters who do not know what's going on, because they don't, and you will not either. And last, not least, let's talk about one of my favorite duologies of all time, let's talk about the Teixcalan duology by Ricardo Matin. This is the first book, A Memory Called Empire. The second one is called A Desolation Called Peace. Both of these books have been out for a while now. Actually, I think Desolation came out in 22 or something along those lines. And I love them so much. Ricardo Matin's writing is incredibly beautiful. If you've already read This Is How You Lose the Time War and you liked the writing style, this is for you. Hands down, full stop. And the thing that I love so much about these books is how deeply and seriously they engage with colonialism, in this case, colonialism in space. So the entire point of this series is we have Mahit Zmada, who is an ambassador from the Cell Station, which is a station that is not yet under the control of the Teixcalan Empire, and she is sent as an ambassador to the Teixcalan Empire in order to get them to not annex the Cell Station, because the, previous ambassador has unfortunately died. And not only is she supposed to go there and, figure out if the Empire is trying to annex her station, she is also supposed to go there to figure out what happened to the previous ambassador. And the special thing about Mahit and her people is that they can import memories from other people into their brains, essentially. And so Mahit gets the questionable honor of sharing her brain with Iskander, who is the current ambassador, or was the current ambassador who then died from the Cell Station to Teixcalan Empire. However, it's an old version, so this version does not know what exactly happened to Iskander on Teixcalan itself. The book is incredibly painful in its depiction of colonialism, and specifically from the lens of a colonized person, and even more specifically from the perspective of a colonized person who finds herself wanting to be part of the empire. Not necessarily in the sense of, oh yes, this is fun, I want to be part of this, and more in the sense of, I have been told so much about the provinces, about the poetry, about the progress that Teixcalan represents, and I am finding myself so torn between my homeland and this land that is trying to annex and capture everything I know, because I have found myself able to understand myself through the language of the colonizer. It is an incredibly painful read in that regard. It's a very slow book. It is very politically heavy, specifically the first one. The second one lets a bit off on that. The second one actually has a lot of other things happening in it. But the first one specifically is incredibly politically heavy, because that is the entire point of the book. And it is such a painful and beautiful read for that specifically. The way these books talk about identity, in spite of or in accord with an oppressing power that is trying to annex you and your homeland and everything you stand for, is immaculate. If any of that sounds interesting to you, I highly recommend this series. I also recommend that you get yourself some tissues, because I personally was a mess after finishing book 2. That's all I'm going to say about that. So yes. This was a lot of books. I tried to narrow it down a little bit, but all of these were either favorites of mine or books that I really enjoyed, or simply books where I was like, I feel like some people are going to absolutely love these books, and so I really wanted to include them here. There is, of course, a lot more queer sci-fi out there. There is starting to be a lot more queer sci-fi, which I personally think is fantastic. And so, again, as I said, if you have any recommendations, please feel free to drop them down below. Also, please feel free to tell me if you've read any of the books I talked about today, and if you liked any of the books I talked about today, or if you didn't like them and why, because I'm always curious. So, yes, welcome to some queer sci-fi recommendations. Do let me know if you want to try any of them in the comments down below. And as always, I hope that you have a nice reading experience yourself, and that you will keep having a nice reading experience. And I will see you soon.